Tutorial hell is a common phenomenon where aspiring or beginner programmers get stuck in a loop following other people's tutorials without ever gaining the skills to code something on their own. As someone who creates coding tutorials with the hopes that people using it or using them will actually move on to code their own projects, the concept of tutorial hell really interests me. Another reason it's of interest to me is that looking back on my own coding journey, I realized that I've never really experienced it. Now, were there times where I tried to learn programming, got frustrated, quit just to try again, at a later date? Absolutely. But I've never experienced the cycle of consuming tutorial after tutorial after tutorial. And looking back, I think it has a lot to do with how I kind of approach learning in the first place. So my path into programming was basically this. I started playing games, then I started modding games, then I tried coding my own stuff, and then I also learned game design. And so at first glance, this path might seem pretty common. A lot of people kind of start by playing games, then modding, and eventually moving into coding and design. But I don't think it was the path itself that made the difference. I think it was how I approached each stage. So I started playing video games as a kid, usually on the easiest difficulty. At the time, I was mostly focused on just playing through the experience. But as I got older, I began to appreciate difficulty. Eventually, I found myself gravitating towards harder games and harder difficulty settings. So over time, I was introduced to more sort of sandbox style games like Kenshi, Dwarf Fortress, and I can't say it, Cataclysm, Dark Days Ahead, I think is what it's called. These games weren't just about completing a story. They were built around systems that interacted in complex and often unpredictable ways. And so that's what really stuck with me. I wasn't just playing the game anymore. I was paying attention to how things worked, how different mechanics connected, and how small changes could affect the entire experience. And no matter how much I enjoyed those games, there was always something that I wanted to change. I wanted to add a system, remove something, or just adjust how something worked. And I think that constant dissatisfaction is what pushed me forward. I wasn't content just playing the systems. I wanted to interact with them and eventually build my own. So eventually I moved from just playing games to modifying them. One of the main games, and I think the only games I modded, was The Sims 3, where I created custom careers, schools, and after-school activities. Some of those mods are actually still up on Mod The Sims. They weren't really complex, and honestly, they're a little embarrassing now. I don't know what was going through my brain at that time, but they were an important step in my development. And so at the time, modding wasn't really about rewriting systems or programming new mechanics. Most of what I did involved just editing XML files, adding and organizing data that the game would interpret. It was more about expanding the game's content than changing how it fundamentally worked. But even though it was just data, it introduced me to something important. Games are built on structured information. So careers had schedules, requirements, pay rates, and progression paths, all of which were defined in the data. So really, without realizing it, I was interacting with the underlying structure of a game. I wasn't just playing within the system anymore, I was starting to shape it. When I finally started learning how to code, I began with Python. So most of what I learned came from two books, Learn Python the Hard Way by Zed Shaw and Make Your Own Python Text Adventure by Philip Johnson. Learn Python the Hard Way helped me understand the fundamentals like syntax, structure, and how to actually write code. Whereas Make Your Own Python Text Adventure, yes, it covered the fundamentals, but it also showed me how to organize a project and think about building a game from the ground up. But even then, the projects I was making weren't really enough for me. They worked and I learned a lot from them, but they didn't match the kinds of systems I actually wanted to create. And so that's kind of where tools like the Quest text adventure engine came in. Using it, I started building my own systems, things like dynamic economies and more complex interactions. A lot of the ideas that I work with today actually started there. I did still use tutorials and other resources, but not in the typical way. I wasn't following them just to complete them. I was using them to solve specific problems that came up while working on my own projects. Even when I didn't fully have the skills yet, I was trying to build things that were slightly out of reach. Looking back, I think that was the biggest difference. I wasn't learning code in isolation. I was constantly trying to apply it to systems I wanted to create. So at some point, I started paying less attention to just building things and more attention to how systems were designed. I began watching a lot of game design content on YouTube, especially talks from the Game Developers Conference. I was particularly interested in NPC AI systems, especially ones developed for games like The Sims. These talks weren't about code, they were about how systems behave, how NPCs make decisions, how different mechanics interact, and how small rules can lead to complex, emergent outcomes. I also came across ideas like giving each NPC a memory or modeling behavior through simple rules. Even when I was still using tools like Quest, I was already thinking about how to design systems that felt more dynamic and interconnected. So over time, I kind of just realized something, and that was that there was only so much I could learn by just consuming this kind of content. Eventually, I just reached a point where there really wasn't anything new to watch or read. And so at that point, really the only thing left to do was to build. So kind of looking back, I don't think I avoided tutorial hell because I had some special approach to learning programming. I think it happened because I was never really learning in isolation. So every stage of my journey, I was engaging with systems directly. So when I was playing games, I wasn't just consuming them, I was thinking about how they worked and what I would change. When I started modding The Sims 3, I wasn't just following instructions. I was modifying structured data and beginning to understand how systems were defined. When I learned to code, I wasn't just trying to complete tutorials, I was trying to build specific systems I already cared about, even when I didn't fully have the skills to do so yet. And when I moved into game design, I wasn't trying to learn new information endlessly, I was trying to understand systems deeply enough that I could build them myself. So that's what I think made the difference. Tutorial hell happens when learning becomes passive, when you keep consuming without ever needing to apply or challenge what you've learned. But in my case, every stage naturally pushed me toward creation. And so eventually watching or following tutorials wasn't enough. I always reached a point where I had to build something myself. And I really think that's why I never got stuck. But anyways, I just kind of wanted to share that story, and thanks for watching.